Kafka Hibino is an ugly, pathetic loser who has no real ambitions and failed promises. Little does he know his life is about to take a huge turn for the worst. The story starts with the boring-looking city being under surveillance and is reported to have nothing unusual happening. Suddenly, a monster called Kaiju swims through the water, starts to attack the city. It sounds off the Kaiju emergency alarms. Citizens immediately start to seek shelter, and others even taking guesses as to which division is going to save the day. Turns out it is the 3rd Division to come to their rescue. As the Kaiju starts going on a Godzilla rampage, destroying everything in its path, the generic version of the Power Rangers from the 3rd Division shows up with a mysterious baddie gracefully jumping out of the aircraft. The rest of her groupies then start to move in. They get into formation and start uselessly shooting the monster. The helicopter then decides to shoot missiles at the Kaiju, which ends up just scratching its back. As the defense force start to close in, they subdue the Kaiju, and our mysterious hottie has had enough of her team's failure and blasts the Kaiju with a bazooka, obliterating it to pieces. It then starts pouring red rain. It then shows our main character, Kafka Hibino, an old, pathetic, ugly loser who has never achieved anything in his life. Stuck as a garbage man, his only job is to dispose and clean up dead Kaiju. Little does he know, his life is about to take a huge turn. Kafka and his co-workers spy from a distance, just like I did after my ex dumped me, and state that it's going to be a long day trying to dispose of the remains and clean up the city. After the Kaiju massacre is complete, the city celebrates the 3rd Division, while our worthless Kafka pathetically stands behind everyone while he waits to clean the aftermath. Finally, Kafka and the rest of the workers come in and clean up the site. As they start to cut down the Kaiju piece by piece, they send samples off to the defense force for testing. As they are slicing the bacon pieces down, Kafka yells at some good-for-nothing co-worker, who decides to move Kaiju bubble guts, causing it to explode and severely burn the worker's leg. Familiar with this, Kafka tells this man to apply for workers' comp. And so for his reward, Kafka gets reassigned poop duty, dreading the stench of nasty intestines. He gets through it, and he ends his day in his lonely, fancy apartment to watch his childhood friend Mina on TV, who is our mysterious baddie, get all the fame and glory as a young captain of the defense force. He then has a flashback of the childhood promise he made of killing all the Kaiju by joining the defense force. He then starts to pity himself, thinking about how he ended up in a situation, but tries to convince himself otherwise, saying his job is important. The next day, a young, plain, ugly-looking kid named Rino Ichikawa joins the disposal team and is introduced to Kafka. His boss tells Ichikawa that Kafka was a loser defense force dropout, which spikes Ichikawa's interest. Ichikawa then tells everyone he is not a quitter like Kafka is, even though he himself hasn't achieved anything. Unlike the future characters in this story, he is determined to be a part of the defense force. Little does he know he's about to be assigned poop duty alongside Kafka. As the day goes on, Kafka tries to help Ichikawa get through the day by giving him something he could stomach, since he needs the nutrients to help him work, and offers him some plugs for his nose to help with the stench. Ichikawa refuses it, so Kafka tries to wrestle him down for it. As they call it a day, Ichikawa thanks Kafka for helping him get through his first workday. He decides to tell Kafka that the defense force raised the age limit, giving our old geezer another chance to break his back to join the defense force. Kafka admits to Ichikawa he isn't a bad kid, and thanks him, when suddenly, a wild Yoju Diglett appears out of nowhere, ready to eat Ichikawa. Kafka jumps in to save him and tells Ichikawa to save himself, and to call in help while Kafka runs off, luring the Yoju away. It then goes into another flashback, showing their childhood city destroyed by a Kaiju, with Mina devoted about her destroyed home and the death of her cat. Does anyone ever wonder what happened to their parents? Anyways, the two youngins make a pact to make it into the defense force together. Now, back in the real world, thinking it's his time to shine, Kafka is determined to prove himself worthy of the Power Rangers, the defense force, and tries to fight off the Yoju. Since he is so weak, Kafka ends up folded like a lawn chair. Kafka is about to be devoured, and Ichikawa appears in time to slap sense into the Yoju. Kafka pities himself as usual by thinking nothing has changed and that he will never be able to protect anyone he cares about. The two face the Yoju. Kafka decides to have a yelling match with the monster, which is useless, like himself. Suddenly, the Kaiju is made into shreds by Mina and her giant white tiger. Points for whoever knows the tiger's name. Comment below. After, Kafka and Ichikawa are taken to the hospital due to their injuries. Kafka starts to loathe himself once again, saying Mina has left him in the dust. Ichikawa starts to simp and says that if it wasn't for Kafka, he would have died that day, and encourages Kafka to join the defense force because of how good-hearted Kafka is. While they're talking, a giant, disgusting mosquito-looking Kaiju confronts Kafka and says he's found him. Before Kafka can call for help, it flies into Kafka's mouth, disgustingly violating him, while Ichikawa is wondering what the heck the commotion is. By the time he pulls the curtain, he discovers a humanoid-like kaiju. It turns out that it's Kafka, who has taken on an insane transformation. Kafka tries to convince Ichikawa that it's really him. In turn, they both freak out, causing a huge commotion and frighten an elderly man who, in turn, decides to call the defense force. Ichikawa then urges they should escape before he is killed. Another flashback appears with young Mina and Kafka in a library, with Mina mocking Kafka of how he aspires to be a hero like in the manga, with Kafka begging her not to tell their mothers, who will end up telling the entire neighborhood. Mina then thanks him and starts to reassure him that she won't be afraid as long as they are together. It then goes back into current time, where Mina briefs the rest of the 3rd Division that a kaiju has been spotted at the hospital and that everyone is in danger. The city's kaiju alarms sound off, saying that there is a kaiju within Yokohama. It is widespread all over the news, and while some citizens are over it, some are cautious. They are then urged to stay indoors. Back at the hospital, the old man is terrified at the sight of Kafka's new kaiju form. Ichikawa suggests that Kafka should flash a smile for the old man, in which he fails miserably, and Gramps ends up fainting due to the sight of Kafka's new ugly face. Kafka tries to help Gramps out and makes things worse by destroying the hospital wall by barely touching it. The rest of the patients come out to see the ruckus. The two decide to make a run for it before the defense force arrives. Kafka attempts to open the window and destroys the wall. Ichikawa states they need to get out of there and jumps out the destroyed building. Kafka follows and makes a huge leap. Meanwhile, the defense force are headed towards Kafka and Ichikawa. As they are running away, Ichikawa asks Kafka if it is really him in his new body. Kafka then replies he isn't even sure anymore, as his body starts to act extremely weird, a little too weird. It gets even weirder when he tells Ichikawa that he needs to pee, and then starts to have a glorious accident. Kafka is embarrassed and pathetically falls to the ground, wondering who is going to take him as a bride, and doubts he has a chance in the defense force. Ichikawa tells him hell, no he wouldn't, and they would kill him on the spot. He falls into despair and believes he won't catch up to Mina ever again. Ichikawa spots a restricted area and says it would be the perfect place to hide, as Kafka senses something is coming. An ugly kaiju. Kafka's new powers now allow him to sense what type it is, the same one that attacked them before. Ichikawa states that it's perfect and that the defense force will split up, which they do. Maybe he's not so useless. In the area where the new kaiju has appeared, a little girl is trying to save her trapped mother. Her mother tells her to save herself. The little girl desperately tries to lift the rubble, but it's too late and the kaiju shows up. Just when the two are about to get wrecked, our not-so-useless Kafka shows up on time, giving it the one-punch man hit, and he's surprised at how much stronger he is. He tries to check on the little girl and tries to cheer her up, which in turn scares the little girl even more. The kaiju makes its way back for more, and Kafka starts powering up, stating he's going to punch it as hard as he can. Kafka counts to 3 and ultimately gives it the Saitama punch, making it rain kaiju blood. Covered in disgust, Kafka tells the little girl to get her mother to the hospital, which the little girl is frightened by the ugly sight of him. Kafka tries to reassure her that the defense force will be there soon and that he will go away once they do. The little girl approaches him and thanks him for helping them. It hits him right in the feels and has the same flashback of he and Mina. Ichikawa urges that they need to leave, as the defense force has been alerted. He is then able to reveal his face, saying he cannot give up and must be by Mina's side. As the defense force arrives, they are confused by what happened, so they ask the scared little girl. Mina reassures her to not be scared and promises that she will destroy all the kaiju, which in turn, the little girl asks Mina not to hurt the nice kaiju that saved her. Mina is shooketh by what she says. NANI? 3 months have now passed, and the news airs the story of the missing kaiju, who is really Kafka, if you haven't noticed by now, and is given the nickname Kaiju Number 8. Ichikawa thinks to himself that it's gotten out of hand, and that Kafka is the first kaiju to have successfully evade from the defense force. At work, Ichikawa is then informed that their results from the admission test have come in. Ichikawa finds out that they both have made it in and has yet to deliver Kafka's results to him. His co-workers say that Kafka deserves it for all the hard work he's put in. When Ichikawa finds him, Kafka is caught in his kaiju form, eating his lunch on top of a dead kaiju. Gross. Ichikawa is pissed and starts beating the shit out of him for letting it slip out. Turns out, they played off the whole ordeal by telling the other patients they ran away when the kaiju showed up. Ichikawa then shows Kafka his results, to which Kafka brushes it off, proudly saying that he always washes out during the second round. Kafka explains he's been trying his hardest to learn to transform to his normal body willingly. Ichikawa precautions him to not transform in front of the officers, or else he will be killed on the spot, and then from then on, the two of them are rivals, and that he needs to get it together. The next day, they both arrive at the Tachigawa base, as the other applicants start rolling in. They are interrupted by an ugly blonde chick, calling Kafka an old man, saying his car is in her parking spot. She demands the spot 55, since it's her lucky number for the day. Kafka starts to freak out when it seems like she's about to develop plot armor and moves the car with one arm, shocking Kafka and Ichikawa with the power of her suit. She reveals herself as examinee 2016 Kikoru Shinomiya, stating her hobby is killing kaiju. Ichikawa recognizes her, but just then, she suddenly sniffs Kafka's stench, saying he reeks of kaiju. Watch this next video and thank you, my fellow otakus.